to the Rule of Law, the Academy Speaks. And I'm Joe Tucker, President of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. And this is our official podcast. Today, I'm honored to have my good friend Stan Garnett from the Garnett Powell firm in Boulder, Colorado, and Denver. But Stan, before we get started, I found out something today. We are actually on YouTube. Kevin, how come you didn't tell me that?
The World Wide Web is a big place.
Okay, where else are we, Kevin?
You can get us on YouTube. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as Podbean, and wherever else you really get your podcasts, Joe.
Okay, because I got an email from someone that they said that I had a face for television, and they were actually watching YouTube. So I didn't know that people could see me, so maybe I'll start dressing up.
Well, you look pretty good, Joe.
Well, thank you, Stan. Stan, you've had a very wide-ranging career. You've been a district attorney, excellent criminal defense lawyer, civil litigator. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your career?
Sure. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and I've practiced 43 years based in Colorado. I've tried cases all over the country. Basically, my career, Joe, is explained by a fascination for courtrooms. Juries, judges have always fascinated me, and I've had the honor and the privilege to try all kinds of cases around the country. I've been at basically 3 different places. I've been in the public sector as a deputy district attorney and elected district attorney. I've been at a large law firm, and I now have the privilege of practicing with my son at a litigation boutique in both Boulder and Denver.
It's a true litigation boutique. Now, one of the areas that you are interested in, which I find unique, is Latin America and their constitution, the constitutions in many Latin American countries. Where did that interest emanate from?
When I was district attorney, I got very interested in the problem of crime committed against the undocumented community, which is a huge problem across the country, but especially in the Western United States. We developed a program to protect undocumented folks in Colorado that got a lot of attention. We got a Human Rights Award from the Mexican government.
What year was that?
That was about 2011. And then in the process of this, we worked closely with the Catholic Church, which of course has good relations with lots of Latin American immigrants. And one of the priests that I was working with said, you know, you'd be a lot more effective if you learned some Spanish. He said, you kind of look like the man. And so I thought, well, that's a good advice. So I got to work, and my Spanish is solid, and I started traveling a lot in Latin America. And I enjoyed the opportunity to meet lots of judges and lawyers and law professors throughout Latin America.
And I'm sure you've taught them about how great the American Constitution is, right?
We have talked about that from time to time. I was thinking about our conversation, and I was talking with one of your staff about it. And in this issue and my ideas about the United States Constitution really were triggered by the fact I was asked in 2020 to give a speech in Spanish to the Bolivian Academy of Judicial Sciences about the Electoral College. And
the American Electoral College?
Yeah, the American, because they couldn't understand what was going on with the 2020 election and, you know, how does this work and everything else. So I put that together and gave it and interacted with my Bolivian colleagues who were completely flabbergasted about what an odd system the Electoral College is and where did it come from and why do we do it this way and you know, what's the logic of it, which caused me to start thinking a lot about our Constitution federally and the aspects that work well and the aspects that don't.
Well, the Electoral College works out perfectly, right, Stan? And that's sarcasm.
Yeah. Well, the Electoral College not only has many problems, but it is a very clumsy and awkward way to elect a president. Obviously, as most lawyers know from their history, there's reasons for that, but it's not particularly democratic.
Well, we don't have only lawyers listening. So why don't you tell us where the Electoral College emanates from?
Well, the Electoral College, like federalism and in the way the U.S. Senate is structured, is rooted in our country's tradition with slavery and the challenge that the founders had to create a constitutional structure that would cause individual states with much different...
I prefer to call them not the founders, because America has always been here, as no different than in Canada they have the indigenous people. I'll call them the writers of the Constitution.
That's fair. That's more precise, absolutely. They had to figure out how to get 13 colonies with very different cultures and backgrounds to unite in a federal government.
Yes.
One of the ways they did that was by creating the Senate the way they did and structuring it. And another way was the Electoral College, which was specifically created to dilute the Democratic vote in the selection of president.
And how was that done as it relates to slavery when you talk about
Well, it was done because the slave states were very afraid that they would be overwhelmed by the free states in the North. And so when the Constitution was formed and as it developed and its interpretation developed in the 19th century, there was this constant effort to try to find a balance that would hold the country together.
So how have you sort of transferred some of our constitutional issues that began with what I call the original sin of slavery to help Latin America, and what have they framed around with your assistance?
Well, what's been really interesting for me, Joe, in talking with my Latin American colleagues is to understand a different view they have of the value of democracy. One of the issues that Americans sort of take for granted is that there's something exceptional and wonderful about the American federal Constitution, and that its functioning means it's democratic, and we should be very proud of that. As I've looked at other countries and how they've functioned and at the problems we have in our own country, I'm in fact convinced that on a federal level, we're not particularly democratic. And as a matter of fact, we have many structures in our Constitution that keep us from being democratic. And when you look at other countries, which many of the countries in Latin America have adopted several constitutions since ours was first adopted in the late 18th century, they're constantly trying to figure out issues like federalism and how do we balance it and how do we make sure there's a real connection to the voice of the people.
Well, I'm almost going to take this to a civics class because many of us didn't get this in high school, and unfortunately it's not being taught enough in our present school system. You talk about the non-democratic nature of some of our aspects of our government. Can you give me other examples other than just the Electoral College?
Sure. There's a number of very glaring examples. The Electoral College, the Senate, federalism generally, and gerrymandering of the House of Representatives in particular. Let me give you an example that may help. Colorado, where I live, is almost identical to Wyoming, just to the north, in terms of size, and similar in geography. They're both, in terms of square miles, almost exactly the same. Colorado has almost 6 million people in population. Wyoming has 600,000. Wyoming's just slightly bigger than Boulder County, where I live, in the entire state. However, Wyoming has 2 senators. It has its own legislature. It has its own system, and very equivalent to Colorado. And there is no incentive for the people of Wyoming and the people of Colorado to come together to work through their issues and to develop compromises, because they're disincentivized from that by the way it's structured. What that does, I think, is reduce the incentive of people in both states to work together and to be involved in the democratic process, and it also dilutes the democratic voices of the many more people in Colorado than you have in Wyoming.
Well, I hadn't planned to go to this high school civics lesson, but we're going to get back to internationally. But, you know, how did, and you and I understand, but could you explain to me how we got to this 2 senators per state? Because you talk about the size of the population of Wyoming. If you look at Wyoming and Colorado together, it's less citizens than are in Brooklyn.
That's true.
And Brooklyn is just one borough in New York City that only has 2 senators. So how And let's not even begin to talk about California and its population as compared to the country. They still only have 2 senators. How do we end up with 2 senators per state?
And I'll answer that. One last example that's glaring. North Dakota and South Dakota have 4 senators in a total population of less than 2 million. California has 2 senators in a population larger than Argentina in the 40 million range. Well, the way we got there was, again, in framing the Constitution, the writers of the Constitution tried to figure out basically how to dilute a pure democracy system. The writers of the Constitution were well versed in Greek and Roman history, and Greece had experimented with complete direct democracy about everything for a number of years through the Greek city-states, including things like letting everybody in town sit in on a jury and vote on guilt or innocence, which, as all of us trial lawyers know, would be an awkward process, to say the least. You had that, and then
instead of convincing 12 people, I'd have to convince like 200,000 people.
200,000 who may or may not be there for the whole trial.
Yeah.
The Romans were very skeptical of certain aspects of democracy and figured out how to kind of control the voice of the people, but still have some sense of it. And the American writers of the Constitution were well versed in these things and tried to figure out how to make a country that had some democratic aspects, but that didn't get ruled by the mob, as they called it, as the Romans called it, which was seen as the irrational voice of the people, which translated means how to keep there from being too much democracy. One way to do it was to have two senators per state and have the Senate have roughly equal legislative power as the House of Representatives.
I understand. Now, how this, and I appreciate the civics lesson. I wish some teachers would just show that portion to their students so they could hear how the American democratic process works and how it was developed. How is that now translated in what you've seen in Latin America and with your assistance that you've given them there?
Well, one of the really interesting things when you talk to people in Latin America, you know, in the United States, we sort of take it as a given that we're a democracy and we value democracy, and democracy is our highest ideal. Many, many thoughtful people in Latin America, as reflected by podcasts and writings and polls, don't see democracy as necessarily the highest goal. What they see is a functioning government. They want to see a government that protects the public, maintains public safety, has a good economy, good schools, et cetera.
But you could have that by a dictatorship, too.
True, that's right. And many Latin Americans will say, look, and we could talk about Bukele in El Salvador, Milei in Argentina. Many Latin Americans say, I'd rather be able to walk to the grocery store and know I'm not going to get kidnapped than have a democracy. Now, if you really sit down and talk to people, they do understand the value of democracy, but they understand the...
I'm going to interrupt you again. Yeah. Do you think that may be some of the thinking that is going on in America now? Give up our rights to almost a dictator, get rid of the rule of law as long as I can walk to my grocery store safely and prices are good. Do you think we're seeing a little bit of that?
I think we are, and I think that's why we see out of one particular political party an effort through flat-out propaganda to create the impression of a crisis, of a public safety crisis and otherwise, so that people will come to value fixing the crisis more than the tradition of democracy that we think we value. Now, on the other hand, Joe, and this is one of the things that I first thought about in discussing this issue with you, the Democrats in the last election talked nationally a lot about this is about protecting and saving democracy. Mm-hmm. And obviously, saving democracy is important, and anybody that knows, values the rule of law, et cetera, understands that. But what concerned me was, I think we do better to have an understanding of the weaknesses in the undemocratic aspects of the current constitutional structure as we get into this, and not to just blithely act like the status quo up until 2016 was we had a national democracy. In fact, we really didn't, and we really haven't for a long time, and therefore some of the issues that we're seeing now, I think, are beginning to play out the way they are.
Well, I think some of that was often because the president generally won the popular vote.
Right.
And not until Gore v. Bush did we start looking at this thing called the Electoral College and began to understand that you could lose the popular vote and still end up being president, that we appreciated we didn't have a full democracy in America, or a true democracy. What else has happened in Latin America as they've looked at America and with the newer constitutions that they've done? How have they, I don't want to say fixed the problem,
Sure.
because as you will hear me say, I happen to think America is the greatest country in the world, and I love America.
Well, I do too, and I think we have great aspects of our system on all levels. Mm-hmm. One thing I will say quickly before I talk about Latin America, I do believe American society is quite democratic on the local and municipal and usually state level. That there our democracy, I think, works quite well, and the voice of the people is heard very well. It's on the national level that I think we run into awkwardness in diluting the voice of the people. Latin American countries have tried a lot of different things. Mexico modeled its constitution in the mid-19th century off of the US Constitution. It had 31 states, it's very structured, federal, et cetera. Colombia has gone back and forth between federalism and a more unitary government. One of the things that's happened recently is many Latin American countries have concluded it's more effective to fight the drug trade, to have a strong national government and less power in states or provinces or divisions. One of the things that Latin American countries have done well, I think, is not to be afraid to scrap an old constitution that's not working very well and adopt a new one. Bolivia adopted a constitution in the early 2000s that is still in place one way or the other, which completely restructured the way the country's governed, recognized 35 different official languages for the country, and has really, and Bolivia is a country with about a 70% indigenous population, has a lot of challenges to try to incorporate that and make it work. But the main thing is, these countries have not been afraid to try different things. I think one of the problems we have in the US is it's so hard to amend our Constitution.
Well, let me talk about that. I'm going to run to a question I was going to talk about at the end. Are you suggesting that we need a constitutional convention here in America to fix some of the issues that the original writers of the Constitution may have done?
I think that would be ideal if we could do it and do it in a responsible way. I don't believe with the current political polarization that we've got that a constitutional convention would be successful. Again, people that know the history of the country know that the original constitutional convention, very intense, went on for weeks to try to figure this out. I have trouble seeing 21st century United States being able to do that. But what I do think we need to do, and this is where I fault somewhat the Democratic Party in its national campaigning, is be realistic about the problems that we have and not act as if the current status quo of the federal Constitution is the democratic ideal.
What do you mean realistic about the problems that we have that you think that the Democratic Party may not be focused?
Well, I think, and again, I don't mean to be, I think both parties tend to blithely discuss the status quo as if it's an ideal, when in fact, our current structure, among other things, with the Senate and federalism and everything else, is diluting the voice of huge masses of people in our country because of the way that all of this works. And we need to be realistic about that and not act as if we have a democratic ideal. If we can be more realistic about that, I think it will help both the younger generation that's coming along trying to figure out how do we participate in this, and hopefully, eventually, there may be some realistic ability to amend the Constitution in some respects and address some of these
When you
problems.
say amend it, you mean a constitutional amendment as opposed to a constitutional convention.
Right, a constitutional convention I think would be very tough to pull off. Amending the Constitution is tough as well, but we have a history of doing some good things by that. The 18-year-old vote for women, obviously all the post-Civil War amendments. I think there's some things that if we got the right conversation going, we could address some of this. But even if we can't get there, being realistic about the fact that the people in the large population states have a diluted voice nationally, et cetera, I think will give us more credibility, particularly with younger voters that are.
You mean, for example, if I'm living in California and you're living in North Dakota, your vote is exponentially much greater than my vote in California.
Right, and a great example of that is the US Supreme Court. US Supreme Court is essentially picked by the president with the approval of the Senate, which means the small agricultural states have a far disproportionate amount of strength in who gets to sit on the Supreme Court. And I think we've got to be realistic. It's not a democratic process. It has created a Supreme Court that we have, which is weighted towards a particular ideological viewpoint, and I think discounts the views of many people in the larger states.
But when you look back at the last election, and I disagree with you on that, because we had the current president win the popular vote in addition to winning the Electoral College. So therefore, it works right sometimes when you have, whether it's Obama who won by the popular vote or whether it's Trump who won by the popular vote. I think that we have to take it all as it comes. What are your thoughts on that?
I think
it ends up balancing itself out at the end of the day.
Well, I think we muddle through pretty well, and it is true that most of the time the winner of the Electoral College also wins the popular vote. You mentioned Bush v. Gore, and of course we had the situation with in 2020 where it was clear who had won the popular vote, and the current president refused to admit it. It creates all kinds of issues. But I do believe one of the first modifications I would want to make to the existing Constitution would be to either get rid of or find another way to approach the Electoral College. If you only have one national official who is elected by a popular vote of the people, you need to make sure that the mechanism of that does not dilute the voice of the people.
What country in Latin America do we look at for an example of something like that?
Well, I don't want to sound as if Latin America is a utopia, because anybody who knows much about Latin America knows that it's not. Latin America struggles, all those countries struggle with the same issues we struggle with. Diversity, inclusion. They have much larger indigenous populations than the United States has. How do we deal with all of this? The smaller Chile has done a pretty good job post Pinochet, the dictator in the 80s and early 90s. Pinochet, I think, is maybe the only dictator in the history of the world who was voted out of office by a plebiscite. He asked for a plebiscite about whether people would support him, and they said no, and he resigned. Now, Chile has been trying to.
I guess that taught dictators a lesson. Don't offer up a vote whether or not I should continue to be a dictator.
There's a lesson there.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, the problem in Chile is a country of 18, 20 million people. Not huge, but significant. They've been trying to amend the Constitution ever since Pinochet stepped down.
Yes.
They had a major constitutional effort after the election of the current president, who is progressive, and they came up with a draft constitution, actually consulted with some scholars in Colorado who are friends of mine, and they couldn't get it passed by the people. But they're trying, they're working on it, and they will get there. Argentina is a very interesting country. It has a long tradition of basically Peronism, of a liberal, progressive, sort of kind of labor-focused effort, which became very corrupt through the years. Milei, who's the current president, who's a libertarian and a pretty bizarre guy, is a reaction to that, and they are making efforts to try to restructure. So I don't know that any of those countries are ideal examples. Uruguay is a very well-functioning democracy right now, but it's also very small. It's 2.5 million people. And I think part of the challenge for the United States is how do we take a country as huge as we are
and
so diverse to develop a functioning democracy.
Yeah. Stan, I'm going to end this like I end most of my podcasts. With these issues that you have framed, I want to thank you also for giving us a brief civics lesson. What gives you hope about America and our Constitution?
the character of the American people. I really, I've been reading a lot about the 19th century right now. The 19th century, with Civil War, everything else, had many, many problems. What gave people hope about the future of the country was that at their core, Americans are good people. They want to be fair, they care about the right things, and they will figure it out. And obviously there's many bad things that happen, and I'm a former prosecutor, so I know there's a lot of bad people. But I believe at our core, Americans in all parts of the country want to be fair, want to take care of their families, and want to treat each other well, and we will figure out a way to do that.
Stan, thank you. And thank you for
Joe.
joining me on the Academy's podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, and
Great.
thanks for your leadership.
All right. Appreciate seeing you. Take
Good
care,
to see
my friend.
you.